So, welcome to this wonderful World Values Day conversation that I am really excited about. I'm Anna McAfee, and I am delighted to be chatting with Craig Shealy. And you could say he's somewhat of an expert on values. He's the executive director of the nonprofit and nonpartisan International Beliefs and Values Institute and a developer of the Beliefs, Events and Values Inventory, also known as BEVI. He's a senior lecturer at the University of Staffordshire and holds a professional doctorate in clinical psychology. And you could say he's been researching our understanding of values long before we have even been talking and potentially even thinking about them. So, Craig, welcome and thank you for joining me in this World Values Day conversation.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
My first question for you, which sounds simple and perhaps isn't so simple, could you tell me what are values?
Well, that's a really great question. What are values? And the answer that I offer, which is based on really over 30 years of research and practice, is important because from what we see, the answer to the question determines how effective our values-based interventions are going to be. So it's important to understand that in sort of public discourse, there are two roads here when you talk about values. There's sort of a public understanding, if you will, of what these things are. And then there's a whole world of scholarly discourse about values that goes back a long way. And those roads often don't meet much. So I'm always glad for these opportunities because it gives us a chance to talk together across the divide, which I think is really important because we all have a common goal, which is to do this sort of work effectively. So the answer to, or an answer to the question of what our values is to say what they're not. Values are not the same thing as beliefs, nor attitudes, nor worldviews, nor schemas, but they exist in relation to these other constructs. It's important to understand values in hierarchical relationship to these other concepts. And this is generally a consensus view in the scholarly literature. There are all kinds of differences of opinion and perspective, but in general, what I'm saying, I think, is a fair representation of some of the major theorists and workers in this area, people like Milton Rokeach, for example. So values are derivative of constructs called beliefs. And values cluster into what we could call schemas and attitudes. And if you put all of that together, you have what's called a worldview. So beliefs cluster into values cluster into attitudes, schemas, what we call a schematitude. And then you put it all together and you have a human being's worldview. It's important to understand that because the building blocks of values are comprised of entities, these belief entities, that in themselves are derivative of core human need. So you can't think about values apart from the beliefs that comprise them, and you can't think about beliefs without understanding something about core human need. And you can't think about core human need if you don't understand something about the human self and human identity, which is the story the self tells about itself. So when you talk about values, you have to understand them in the context of this sort of levels of analysis, this kind of matrix of interconnectivity. That's the first thing to say. The other thing to say about values is that because they're comprised of these beliefs, and values and beliefs exist in the service of human need. And by need, I mean things like human attachment, what we would call appetitive needs, hunger, thirst, sleep, bodily needs, all the way up to actualization needs you may have heard of from people like Abraham Maslow. And in the perspective we work with, which is called the continuum of core need, you have appetitive needs on one end of the continuum, and then you have awareness needs on the other end of the continuum. So human needs are both physiological and they're psychological. Okay, they exist along this continuum. beliefs that we have are derivative of, well, they're derivative ultimately of our evolutionary history. We think the species is somewhere around 300,000 years old. So you have to imagine belief structures as having adaptive significance for our survival. And that makes a lot of sense because the things that we believed are either going to be allow us to get our core needs met, and therefore survive, or they're not. And it's all a relative to a relative degree. So when you try to answer a question like what is values, you've got first of all the issue of values as they relate to these other concepts. You also have the question of how values are derivative of core human need. And then you have the larger self in which all of this exists. And then you have the purpose of values. What do they serve in the life of a human being? So I'm always trying to make these answers simple, simple as possible, but it's difficult to do when you're dealing with really powerful, integral constructs like values.
So that is very different to I guess, what a lot of values practitioners and even people like Brené Brown will say, which is, here's a list of values, pick your top
Yeah,
values and
yeah,
and and wear them as a badge
yeah.
type thing.
And
That's
and
extremely
there's nothing
different.
wrong. Yeah, and
Um,
there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, people do, organizations have values. We have values. We have, mission statement values, these kinds of things. Those are all really important things to do. Where this stuff matters is when you actually try to intervene and engage value structures. When you're trying to change values, meaning that you're trying to change the way people think or they feel or the way that they behave. When you're doing that for the purpose of change, creating change, from our perspective, you're engaged in what we would call a values-based intervention, or a VBI, a values-based intervention. Values-based education, the kind of work that World Values Day is doing, many other practitioners and scholars around the world, these very powerful and important activities that people are engaged in, these are ultimately attempts to try to influence, to shape, to try to get people to think or feel or a certain way or to behave in certain ways. When you start into that realm, you are inadvertently activating these structures that I'm talking about, which are not only psychological and conceptual, they're also neurobiological. They exist in physiological form, they're neurochemical as well. So you can't just expect that if you try to shape the way what people value or how they believe about things, that or tell them what to value or believe, that somehow that's going to have any real impact that is going to be in the direction you want if you're not paying attention to the underlying structures that the values sit in the middle of or represent for an individual or a group or in a society or a nation. That's why it's so important that we think about these ideas and concepts and understand what the research says, as well as what makes for effective practice if we're going to try to influence the way people think or feel or what they do.
mhm. Yeah, I was thinking, and I was going to ask you about those implications of, I guess, the dynamics of needs and how that really affects the actions and the policies and practices within the education that so many of us are
Yeah,
trying to do. What would
yeah.
be your advice for people who are educators in terms of changing the way or even understanding how to better influence or better educate
Yeah,
on values? I
yeah.
mean, how do our approaches need to change?
Yeah, I'm curious from your perspective, do you see a failing in that regard, or do you see problems in that regard?
Well, I think, and I suppose it's moving on to my next question, which is really just, I mean, in the realm of, I think it's safe to say we live in a pretty volatile world, particularly certainly with a lot of online discourse. Say, for example, around certain values, I guess.
Mm,
The one I see a lot that's perhaps people are trying to educate more on is sustainability, and there are just There's no amount of science or experience-based things that I think sustainability educators they're not getting through. And
Right,
you could pick a whole, I mean, we could be talking about diversity, we could be talking about, all sorts of, I think,
right,
I think it's safe to say in the online space in particular, there is a lot of discourse happening, and it's
right,
happening in politics and all sorts of places too. But so I guess just picking one of those being, say,
right,
sustainability, how, if someone is in that education space of actually trying to educate,
right.
why is the education not getting through? Is this coming
Yeah,
down to the needs and the values and that hierarchical
yeah,
structure?
yeah. Yeah, no, I think you've really put your finger on the a core of the a problem, and honestly, this is one of the things that we spend a lot of time looking at. A core motive, I suppose, for the nonprofit, the International Beliefs and Values Institute, that I'm part of, as well as the measurement work that we do through the Beliefs, Events, and Values Inventory, or BEVI, is trying to understand what are the mediators and moderators, the interacting processes, forces that influence whether change occurs. And the reason that that matters is because, like you said, we spend billions on interventions that are trying to shape how people think and feel and what they do, how they believe, essentially, and what they do with those beliefs that they have. And in large part, from an empirical perspective, in terms of the evidence we have, many of those interventions not only don't work in terms of the outcomes that we imagine that we're trying to achieve or that we state are our objectives, they often can backfire, have the opposite effect of what it is that we're planning. You take something like diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, or in the UK, EDI, the same concept in reverse. Um, so here's a framework. Those of us who've been doing work in the field of multicultural assessment and practice, which I've been privileged to do for many years with lots of amazing people all over the world, have known for a long time empirically that when you get up and try to promote these concepts, diversity, equity, and inclusion, through workshops or trainings, think of the kind of things you have to do in an organizational setting. If you had to take a workshop, a sensitivity workshop, for example, and what your experience of that is, or you have to go to a workshop on diversity or sensitivity. It could be around culture, gender, whatever it might be. It's not that the values of these types of approaches are the problem. The values of fairness and justice, access, voice, dignity, these kinds of values, I personally have no problem with at all. In fact, I've spent my life, as I'm sure many of the people who are watching this have as well, trying to promote these kinds of values in the world toward issues of culture and gender and so forth, to make the world a more just and fair place. So the problem is not the values of DEI. Same thing could be said for the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, and education for sustainable development. The educational initiative that's there to promote the Sustainable Development Goals. Same kinds of concepts are operative here. Not the values that are the problem, what people are trying to achieve. It's the way these initiatives are designed, delivered, and discussed. Designed, delivered, and discussed. That's where the problem comes in. And we know that because we look at where people are, we measure where people are through mixed methods, depth-based comprehensive measurement using the BEVI and other measures. We know where people are at the beginning of these interventions and where they end up at the end. And what we find often is that who people are at the beginning of the intervention, a DEI intervention, for example, a multicultural course, could be study abroad, could be something like that. Who people are, how they're structured at the level of self and identity at the beginning of the experience is quite predictive of how they end up at the end of the experience. So the people who don't have any problem with DEI are already heavily predisposed toward DEI. The people that often struggle with it are structurally, from a belief value perspective, not organized in a way that the way DEI type experiences are typically taught or expressed. the values, quote unquote, of those approaches, or the way that they're designed, delivered, and discussed, is activating of the internalized structure of people who are not predisposed toward them. And what happens empirically is, by the end of the experience, they've either remained flat in terms of measurement of whether they change on sociocultural openness or global resonance or other kinds of skills like that. They may actually become less open to the kind of information that's being presented in the context of DEI or education for sustainable development and so forth, because the developer, the deliverer, the designer of the intervention was not paying attention to who the audience was. That's one big problem. The second, even bigger problem is there's not enough understanding of how learning, growth, and change actually occurs. So when we're trying to influence people or trying to change their belief value structure, this isn't just a neutral exercise. We're actually engaging ultimately the neurobiology of people, as well as the identity self-structures of human beings that are derivative of their lifetime of experience. What we call the formative variables, their gender, their culture, their language, their education background, their religious systems, so forth. All of those variables, their interactions with their caregivers, their community, their society, that has all been internalized as belief value structure that's tethered to these core human needs that I've been describing. So when we're hitting people with these concepts from DEI or the Education for Sustainable Development or any of these kinds of things, same thing in the United States with DARE, drug abuse resistance education, this multi-million-dollar effort to get kids, young people, not to use drugs. It was a failure. Not only was it a failure, in some cases, it actually was associated with the opposite impact, at least in one study I can recall, of what it was intending. That's because, again, the people who are attempting to shape how people think or feel or behave are not aware of where the structures is, what that stuff is inside us that we're attempting to engage as educators, nor how to do that in a way that's more likely to be effective in terms of the outcomes that we perceive. The bottom line from our perspective is what we call the 8 Ds in terms of, because I'll often get the question, well, so what causes change then? And what we say is that, well, there are 8 Ds that are part of this. And I always print them off just to make sure I can remember, but they are duration, how long the experience is, difference, how different is the experience someone's being exposed to from what they're accustomed, depth, how able is the person to be able to receive or experience the phenomena that we're trying to share, drive, the fourth D, how motivated are people to change? Are they motivated at all? Are they not motivated? Are they motivated against it? Determine, how well does the person who's trying to make the change, how well have they determined who their audience is? Have they assessed their audience? Do they know where the audience is coming from? Doesn't have to be formal assessment like the BEVI, could simply be trying to understand where people are coming from. Design, how well is the intervention designed? How well is it put together? Deliver, how well is it delivered? How skillfully is the person able to actually deliver the intervention that they've developed? And then debrief, how well do people check in with their audience before, during, and after the experience to determine how it has gone? These 8 Ds are empirically supported factors that seem to be associated with whether these kinds of values-based interventions, like values-based education, how effective those things are in terms of creating change.
So that was going to be my question, and you've maybe just started to answer it, or maybe that is the answer, is if you are a DEI educator or a sustainability educator or an educator on anything to do with values, knowing now what you're saying, what's the next step? Like what should DARE have done differently, to use an example? Um,
Uh,
so
well,
is it
yeah, go
looking
ahead.
at those 8 Ds?
Yeah,
Um, or is there some other, if you're tasked with delivering a program and you want it to land,
yeah,
in a way that people will
yeah,
receive it well,
right,
um, based on your research, what do we need to do? What's
yeah,
the step before the delivery of the program that makes it more
right.
effective? Or is it or is there another way? Yeah, it's finding I guess, and maybe solution. Maybe there isn't a solution, but people are always looking for them.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. And it's a noble thing to want to pursue and achieve. I guess I would say that DARE is a good example. Same thing with abstinence only programs, these kinds of interventions that attempt to that somebody has in their head. And this isn't a partisan statement because the left does it through things like DEI, the right does it with things like drug abuse resistance education or abstinence only. I mean, these are attempts that humans make to influence how other humans think, feel, and behave. Okay, so everybody does this across the continuum. We do this in our homes, in our families, we do it in our relationships. This is ubiquitous. And this doesn't just apply to education, it applies to clinical intervention, as a clinical psychologist doing therapy. It applies to leadership, how people lead, for example. So the work we're talking about here is really broad. Okay, so to get to your question, I guess my first recommendation, if I can, is to step back for a minute and try to focus on what we really understand about how human beings work. Who are we? That would be my first recommendation. Understanding, well, what are these things called beliefs and values? Where do they come from? What purpose do they serve inside humans? As I've said, beliefs and values exist in the service of need. Human beings are going to get their needs met in life. That's our purpose, one of them at least. So if we don't understand that, just hitting people with value-based content that we think is better and that therefore others should respond to favorably, ignoring the fact that beliefs and values exist in the service of need, means that we're already destined probably to be less effective than we could be. So my number one recommendation would be to understand human beings better. More specifically, to understand what these things called beliefs and values are and what purpose they serve inside, if you will, human beings. That would be a first recommendation. The second thing I would recommend, and this comes out of a lot of the research and practice we've done, is to rethink the way we go about designing, delivering, and discussing our interventions. Take something like abstinence, sex ed abstinence type programs, which have had all kinds of energy behind them in the United States and other parts of the world. If you look at this through a nonpartisan lens, which is what we always try to do, you can appreciate the goal which I appreciate as a father, as a citizen, of not having people get pregnant, for example, before or get a disease that's unnecessary, without really knowing what they're doing, or without feeling like this is something that is really in their best interest, but not even knowing how to ask a question. So I can appreciate in some ways the impulse of abstinence only, right? The problem with it is that it's completely removed from the forces and factors that drive young people.
And from
It's
culture.
completely, what's that?
And from culture. Yeah.
And historically,
Mm.
it's mediated by concepts that are divorced from fundamental aspects of who we are as a species. So if you think about it like that, which is again understanding what these things are inside people, what purpose they serve, you would approach abstinence or sex education, if you will, from a very different perspective. You'd start there probably. You'd
Mm.
talk about what is the purpose of this for us, and what does it do? Why do we do this? Where does it come from? And then, well, here are the things, here's why we do it. Here are the things about it that make it so compelling and powerful for people. Let's be honest about that. This is what drives a lot of it. It's certainly physical, but it also is, familial, it's relational, it's societal, it's survival for the
Mm.
species, as well as all these other wonderful things. It's love, it's all of it. So I would talk about all that. And I would spend time in the process of doing this spending a lot of time. If there's one recommendation we have, is to, in terms of education in general, especially around controversial or values-based issues, is to spend a lot more time understanding who our audience is, appraising how they feel and what their experience is and what they're telling them, what we're telling them, and giving them time to tell us and one another what it's like to be experiencing the content that we're providing. So a lot more focus on process rather than content. So to summarize, I would say understand who we are much better, understand the purpose of beliefs and values, what they serve, whatever the content is we're trying to deliver, and then making sure that we pay attention to the process that's operative when we're attempting to influence how people think, feel, and behave. I could be more specific, but that would be a general recommendation. And if you look at a lot of the paradigms, the pedagogies around like education for sustainable development, diversity, equity, inclusion, drug abuse resistance education, absence only, these kinds of methods and models that we've developed as societies, and you look at how they go about the business of what they do, it doesn't do any of the things that I've just suggested in terms of how what we see from evidence from the research we do as well as the practice that we develop and look at, evaluate, it doesn't do any of that stuff. It just basically designs something, delivers it, talks about it, and says, well, there it is, we did it. And it generally doesn't work. Or it backfires, and you get the results you do, like in the United States. And this is not a partisan statement, but you get the results you see in the United States right now of the dismantling of DEI initiatives. And although the values of DEI I support completely, I honestly can appreciate, lamentably, why DEI, as it typically is designed, delivered, and discussed, has not been effective. That's no crack on the people who are developing these interventions. I'm with them on the values, as are many people across the political spectrum. Fairness, justice, these are not issues that the left of any society can claim for its own. These are universal values, and the entire socio-political continuum gets to have a say in that. It just may express those values differently from where they sit across that socio-political continuum. But if we make a claim on either side that our version of fairness and justice is the right one and your version of fairness and justice is not, we're already in a serious problem in terms of any interventions that we have around DEI or anything else. So we spent billions on this. We see the outcome. Respectfully, I would suggest looking at these core things I've suggested: who we are, what beliefs and values serve in the context of who we are, and how we design, deliver, and discuss them at a process level. Looking at those things more closely would be economically, fiscally wise, as well as effective, much more effective in terms of our interventions and policies.
The thing that I guess is sprung to mind, and when I've heard you speak before, Craig, and just in our conversation just now, is I think that, and maybe it isn't a value, but the thing that keeps springing to mind that I think people I feel really threatened by, and is the word that keeps coming into my mind is the word safety. Um,
Mm.
and I feel like safety is such, and I don't, I mean, is safety a value or a need? But perhaps it's both.
Both.
We can
Yeah,
debate that
yeah,
one.
yeah.
Um,
It's a
but
great question. Yeah,
that is to me what in the crux of what I mean. It's not landing as a phrase that
yeah,
I use, um,
yeah.
because because it doesn't feel safe, or it
Right,
threatens the existing safety that people have.
right,
Um,
right.
so I'm curious to what your thoughts are on that,
Yeah, yeah.
and
It's a
whether
wonderful.
safety
It's a
is a need or a value
yeah. Well, I would
or
I
a
would say
belief.
depending on. Pardon
Mm.
me, or what?
Or a
What did
belief.
you? Yeah. Well, it has elements of all of that. That's why it's such a great question, because it reverberates across different levels of analysis for different but interrelated reasons. So the theory behind the BEVI, the beliefs, events, and values inventory, is called equal integration, or EI theory. And EI theory is really derivative of a whole bunch of other theories and perspectives. People, brilliant people like Jean Piaget, for example, many of the people who work on issues of attitude change, or some of the self-psychologists, people out of developmental psychopathology, there are all kinds of people who feed into these sorts of perspectives that comprise the theory that underlies equal integration, or EI theory, that underlies the BEVI. The EI self is the way that we attempt to represent this in three-dimensional form. And some of the AI implications, which we do with the BEVI, allow people essentially to take the measure and go into themselves. So they can have an experience of themselves, and they talk with the entity who lives in the BEVI-verse, being BEVI, this AI entity who lives in the world of the BEVI, the BEVI-verse. And they can go in after they take the BEVI and encounter themselves. Being BEVI will talk with them about, how am I built? Is basically what people ask. We're doing this all over the world now. And Being BEVI will say, well, according to what I'm seeing here with the BEVI, you have you have this way of relating to your emotional world. You have these kinds of life experiences that you've reported. This is how you approach issues of meaning, or this is how you see the other. This is how you see gender or culture or religion. Okay. And here's the result of all this in terms of how much you like doing that kind of stuff, how difficult it is for you, how that impacts ultimately the reality of this is how does that impact, as Freud said, work and love, love and work, that's all there is. It's purported to have said. So, how does all of this relate to your relationships, the life that you lead, your sense of meaning and purpose while you're schlepping around the planet for some period of time? Okay. So, safety, I would argue, is at the very core of how you enter discussions like that. Because, as I said earlier, when you start talking with people about their values, you're not just talking abstractly or philosophically, you're talking about their inner structure. You're talking about how they are built, how all of us are built. That's not just a psychological phenomenon, it's physiological, it's neurobiological. So, safety is a really important question because when you start talking to people about these things, you're talking about the structure that exists, that lives within them, that is designed to meet their core need in life. And if you challenge that structure, because the beliefs that have come out of their adaptive process of trying to get their needs met in life in a particular sociocultural context, and what belief structures have been laid down as a result of that, and you're presenting different beliefs to them, or beliefs that may or may not be consistent with what they've internalized, you are threatening potentially the very structure of self. Or identity. Again, identity is the self's story about itself. So when the BEVI is looking at all of these different scales, it is essentially taking an X-ray or taking an audit of your structure. And it's telling the intervener, here are things to pay attention to if you're going to try to reach this human being in a way that feels safe for them, feels like it can be congruent with their structure. Because even people who are racist, sexist, all these terms that we apply, and I'm not saying there's no validity to these terms, okay? As a clinician in particular, I see these kinds of phenomena all the time, right? But those kinds of phenomena that people express through their words, which is the level at which beliefs and values occur, it's verbal, conscious expression. But the thing to remember about beliefs and values at that level is it's always tethered to this emotional, unconscious, needs-based, ultimately physiological structure. So the words that people utter tell you something about the structure inside them. So we need to pay really close attention rather than just condemning people for what they believe, telling them they're bad or stupid or whatever. A wiser approach, a more effective approach, a more humane approach, even if we viscerally react to what it is we're hearing people say, and I do, you may as well. But a more effective approach, a more humane approach, is to understand, whether you agree with it or not, is to understand, where does that belief value structure come from? Why is it there? If you'll do that, you have a much, much greater chance of understanding the people that you're attempting to engage, much less being effective if you're going to try to implement any sort of intervention with them.
Mm,
And safety, therefore, is at the core of the whole thing.
how interesting. Fascinating stuff, Craig. I'm conscious of time, and I have two, I guess, two more questions for you, if that's okay. My first one is actually around your own values. Could you tell us
Yeah.
one of your own values, where it came from and how you put it into practice? I
Mm,
ask this of everyone if you're new to
sure,
these interviews, for anyone
sure.
watching, but it's one of my favorite questions because I think it's quite telling. But what are one of
Yeah.
your values that you live by?
That's a wonderful question and a hard one to answer in any simple way, as an academic, especially. But I'll take a crack at it. I suppose if I had to give a value, a single value, it'd probably be something like meaning making, making meaning. And to be honest with you, as a clinician, as a therapist, and an educator, and a citizen, and a researcher, the thing that is most poignant and often painful, I suppose the driver of a lot of this for me, is seeing how much unnecessary suffering there is in the world and how much wasted time and energy, wasted resources are expended in the world because there's a lack of understanding of what it is that we're attempting to, why it is that we do what we do, and how we can make sense of that and intervene and help one another, kind of move forward. So when you're working with people in therapy, for example, a couple who are in hell as a married couple, or doesn't even have to be married, just they're together. They're in hell because of these structures that they have internalized inside them that are getting in the way of them being able to even articulate what they need because of the life experiences they've had and how that's been clustered around these belief value structures. When you're able, as a clinician, to get into the core of the thing that is the living thing between those people that connected them in the first place and pull back some of that belief value, that wall, that level of analysis that gets in the way of the core need, oftentimes there'll be this huge rush of emotion, of longing, hope, between that couple to be able to have the experience of the thing that brought them together in the first place. That wish, that's probably at the core of it for me, honestly.
It's a great answer. Great answer. Craig, to finish up, where can people find more about your work? Um, Websites,
Sure.
socials?
Well, what you guys are
Where
doing,
do
the
you
world values.
where should
Yeah.
they go?
Yeah. Well, I would put in an unsolicited plug. You didn't ask me to do this, but I think what you're doing to the World Values Day is essential. It's at least getting the concepts out there to the world that these things exist. I would go there for one thing. Um, there's that. There's an organization that is relatively new that is meant to be a home for those of us who work in these areas, even if we don't know we work in these areas. So, those of us who are inclined toward values based interventions or interested in these phenomena, whether we even call it values, we're trying to influence things in the world. It's called the Global Alliance for Values Based Education. It's if you do the HTTPS thing and then do GAVE, GAVA.global, you'll find GAVE. Join up, join
And
us.
and so can you tell us more about GAVE and sort of what are its goals or its purpose?
Yeah, GAVE is designed to be a home for everyone, an inclusive, open place, a professional home for people who study these things, who design educational interventions, who are trying to make the world a better place around values-based education what's called VBE, as well as values in general, things like character counts in the United States, for example. There are all kinds of things that people do that are oriented around GAVE's mission. So it's a home for people who believe in all the things or are interested in all the things we're talking about. I'd encourage that. If you want to go deeper into the world that I've been describing here, you're certainly welcome to look at our work through the IBAVI. That's IBAVI, International Beliefs and Values Institute.org, IBAVI.org, or the BEVI. If you want, you're welcome to look at the BEVI website, the Beliefs, Events, and Values Inventory, at BEV, thebevi.com. Those would be among the resources that can help deepen and further this discussion. And we welcome collaboration. We do a lot of this work all over the world. It's what keeps us going. And please come join us, help us learn from you, and see how we can help you in your work.
Fabulous. Thank you, Craig. I will pop the links below in the video for anyone who's made it to the end. Thanks for watching, and thanks for such a great conversation.